Do you have a stubborn dog who just wants to pull on the leash or do their own thing, even when you're using treats to train them? In this video, we're going to talk to you about a dog training checklist that's going to help you to get more focus from your dog. And we're going to let you in on a couple of secrets that we've learned from the more than 90,000 dogs that have been trained at our training facility. I'm Ken Steep.
I'm Kayl McCann.
Welcome back to McCann Dogs.
Ken and I just got back from teaching classes today, and it was a pretty exciting day because it was the students' very first time at our school with their dogs. And it's an exciting time because the dogs are highly distracted. And one of the most common things that we hear from people in their early stages of training is, my dog's so stubborn and he doesn't want to take the food. What else can I do? So we wanted to take some time to talk to you today about why that happens, why some dogs are deemed as stubborn, and some tips that we can do to help sort of move around that barrier.
For sure. And this is definitely something that I've heard from a lot of students. And I know it's in the comments section of our videos. It's something that I hear mentioned quite often. So we're going to outline a few tips that you need to sort of be aware of while you're training your dog, that you can check things off. And you're going to very quickly discover that it isn't necessarily the treats that's making your dog stubborn. There's a few other things that you really need to be aware of if you find that you're not getting some focus from your four-legged family member.
One of the most common complaints I get from my students or frustrations is that when they go for a walk, they could say, I could put the biggest steak in front of my dog's face and they still don't want food. They just want to pull and drag me to the park. And I've been there, so I know that can happen. It's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we will suggest to help work on that is, if you can't control the dog with the food that you have and you're not having success in that certain environment that you're practicing in, for example, walking to the park or whatever it might be, the only other option that you have is to change your dog's environment and build the success in something that's a little bit less challenging with less distraction. So, it's a good idea to rate the distraction level, out of 10. So if you're going for a walk to the park and there's a bunch of other people and dogs and kids and excitement going around, that's probably a level 10 distraction for a lot of dogs. Can your dog give you the focus that you need when you're in the house and there's nothing going on? That would be like level 1. So what people often make the mistake of doing is they think they have things perfected in a level 1 or 2 distracted environment, and then they hit it with a 10 and try to walk to the park, and then everything unravels very quickly. So what you want to do is blend in distractions more gradually, teaching your dog to be able to function and focus on you without having things around you that are quite so difficult to compete against. It could mean that maybe in your house you start to incorporate more distractions, put some of your dog's favorite toys on the ground, or we will use food containers that have a lid on them and little holes poked in the top so the dog can smell the food, but they can't get it, and we'll scatter that everywhere, and we'll work on our exercises so it's not just nothing going on. The dog has some choices to make. And then we might practice in the driveway for 30 minutes instead of walking in the neighborhood for 30 minutes. So it's the same amount of time, but you're just not exposing the dog to so much stuff in the beginning. And then of course you can work into making things a little bit more challenging. But everything about the way we train dogs here at McCann's is about building on success. And what they learn first, they learn best. So you want to start off easy, and then as the dog's showing some improvement, then slowly start to make it a little bit more challenging.
And it really brings up the point when people will say, my dog is so stubborn, he always pulls when we go on walks. He's not the one making the choice to go out for these same long walks and pulling down the street. You need to break down that challenge for him. You need to show him how to be right. We talk a little bit about, using the right kind of food. That maybe that's part of it, but that environment is such a really, really important one. The other thing you may not be aware of is maybe your dog is worried about the environment. Maybe you're in a location environment.
Maybe that's why they don't want food.
Exactly. That's too overstimulating or concerning to them, and they won't take food in that situation. So really, take stock of what's going on around you, the response that your dog has, and maybe reduce the challenge for them a little bit. It's not them that's stubborn, it's you that's stubborn, insisting that you try the same things over and over again without any sort of affecting any change.
If you think that you have a stubborn dog or a dog that's not really interested in working for food, the most obvious suggestion that we would make is look at the food that you're using and make sure it's valuable. But what you also need to consider is, does your dog actually find food to be a valuable thing to work for in in the first place. And a very common question that we will ask our students is what their feeding schedule is, because sometimes changing your dog's feeding schedule can make all of the difference in your dog's drive to work for food.
Yeah, and this isn't just limited to what time of day that you're feeding them, but there's some people that will free feed their dog. And if you're not sure what free feeding is when you put down a certain amount of food and then you just leave it out all day, and your dog is able to sort of move around and choose on their own when they eat from there. And one thing that we've discovered is that it decreases the value of food for your dog. I know some of this, sometimes you'll suggest that to a student. You'll say, are you meal feeding or free feeding? And you'll suggest them change to meal feeding, and you'll see a 180-degree turn from that dog. By the next week.
Yeah.
Because you've increased the value of the food. So if you're free feeding your dog, where you place down food in the morning and there's a half full bowl of food all day long, then you'll want to switch to meal feeding. And let's talk just for a moment about what meal feeding is exactly.
Yeah, so meal feeding is when your dog has a specific amount of food that they get at breakfast, and then again in the evening for dinner. And for little baby puppies, we sometimes even suggest giving them a lunch. Once they get about 4 months old, though, we feed just twice a day. So we put the food down, we give them a few minutes to eat, and then we will remove the bowl from there. And if you're switching a dog from free feeding to meal feeding, you may find you put the food down and they don't eat as much as you'd like right away. You're simply just going to lift the bowl up and then put it back down at the next feeding time that you'd like to do. And within a couple days, the dog will start to eat much more consistently. Mm-hmm. Now, the beautiful thing about this is rather than putting the food down for the dog to eat, you also can then start to use the food for training time. So I might, take a handful of their food and have, my dog do some exercises, some sits, some look at me's, things like that. And then I might allow them to eat the rest of the food out of the bowl, so I can start to time my practice sessions for the same time that my dog is used to eating their breakfast or dinner, when their body already tells them that they're hungry.
And as an added bonus to meal feeding, you're also going to have an early indication if your dog isn't feeling well. Oftentimes the first sign of your dog not feeling great is that they aren't eating their food as they normally would. And if you're free feeding, you might not notice something like that. Mm-hmm. So the added benefit of increasing the value of your dog's food by meal feeding is having that awareness of their intake and sometimes their output can be really, really valuable. So meal feeding, we suggest that for any dog owner.
The last thing that I want to add about meal feeding is your dog's weight. We see a lot of dogs that are very, very overweight, and typically those dogs are free fed. It's hard to control. If your dog is overweight, that also can lead to your dog not being that interested in working for food while they're already full. So really look at your dog's weight, make sure that they're not overweight. Obviously for health reasons, that's the most important thing. Yeah. But also if you're looking to train your dog and get them motivated to work for you, you want them to be a little bit hungry when they're excited to work for food, because it makes it, a more enjoyable experience when they get to eat that treat.
One thing that people often do, and something I want you to be very conscious of, is what are you rewarding your dog for? Think about why you're giving them the food. So what we want is for our puppies or our young dogs to really understand that food reward is something that's earned, that they put in a little bit of effort and that they're being rewarded for that. And this is something that we talk with our students a lot about.
Yeah, people often just sort of feed because it sort of seems like the right thing to do, but they're not actually looking to see what the dog is doing at the time. Are they, on a loose leash? Are they paying attention and looking at you when you're offering a reward? Rewards need to mean that, what you're doing at this exact moment, I love and I want you to keep doing again. So be really, really aware that you're not just feeding for, them being cute or doing nothing really at all. We want your dog to understand that rewards are special and they are given through great behavior.
I was actually talking to a student just the other day. He just signed up for grade 1 training and he just found us not long before, I think here on the YouTube channel. But he mentioned that he was worried about using human food, like cooked steak or cooked chicken with his dog, because he didn't want to encourage the dog to beg or hover around the table when they were having their meals. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people expect, that they can't use human food with their dog because they're worried about the dog begging for it.
Yeah, we often make that suggestion suggestion and then people cringe at us. But what people don't realize is that what causes dogs to beg or, feel like they deserve food when you're at the dinner table is if they're actually fed in that situation. So if you're hoping for your dog not to beg at the table, don't feed them when you're at the table.
Right.
Don't feed them from, from your plate or from the table. Encourage your dog to go, and lie down and do something productive so they're, not hanging around. But we actually suggest that you use things like cooked chicken wieners, leftover steak, those types of things as your high value reward. So one of our favorite things to do when we're training our dogs is use a number of different rewards, and then we rate them from like our dog's favorite, so like a number 5 treat all the way down to a number 1 treat. And then we would utilize those different treats based on the exercise that we were working on and how difficult it was, and B, where are we practicing in? Are we in a low distracting environment, or are we in a really tough place like walking the kids to the school, where there's kids and dogs and stuff everywhere? I would be taking my greatest, highest value treat in that moment. So using, food items like that we eat, they're exciting for the dog. They're not something that the dog gets all of the time. They're semi-moist, easy for the dog to eat. There's a lot of pros to using that, and you certainly don't need to be worried about the dog starting to beg if you use them correctly.
Yeah, and you mentioned briefly some behaviors that you might think at home, my dog's so stubborn, he's just not going to pay attention to the food. Dogs are going to do what's rewarding. So what you need to keep in mind, if you feel like your dog is not that interested in your food, as Kayl had mentioned, is this is when you're going to bring out that you need to unlock that drive. So you need to figure out what's that thing they absolutely love more than going to visit another dog, more than pulling you on a leash or visiting another person. This is where you start to see the world from your dog's eyes. What's more valuable? It's not your dog that's stubborn. You just haven't discovered the way to really encourage that focus or that attention.
I'm smiling because earlier today I was teaching a class, and a woman was teaching. We were towards the end of the class, and the dog had done quite well, but it was starting to fizzle out, wasn't as interested, and she was trying to work on teaching the dog to come when it was called, and it was looking all over the place, and the woman was trying so hard and she was getting so frustrated. So I just pulled some of my treats out, and I had dried liver at the time, and I said, why don't you try this? And she let her dog sniff it, and the dog's eyes just lit up.
Right, yeah.
And we ended up getting 3 or 4 fantastic repetitions of the recall, and she was so excited. She was taking pictures of the treats to making sure she could go get some from her dog. But even just switching the treats to something higher value can make your and your dog's experience training together that much more fun and positive.
For sure, and I think that's the perfect segue. And speaking of segues, something people often overlook when they're training their dog, and we see this in classes a lot. I know in talking to students when they go out and train in their regular environments, whether it's on their street, in their house, wherever, something they overlook is the variety of reward. And talk about the benefit of changing it up a little bit.
Yeah, often you could have a really high value reward like steak or hot dog wieners or whatever it might be, and it's not uncommon for dogs just to sort of get sick and tired of that particular taste or flavor. So we find it extremely effective to use several different types of rewards. You could have them separated and have a little baggie of hot dogs, have a little baggie of block cheese, have a little baggie of dried liver, whatever it might be, and switch it up depending on what you're working on. Or you could go for the whole trail mix routine where you put a whole bunch of treats and mix them together. So each time you bring something out, it's something new for your dog, and that can also be a much more effective way to keep the engagement from the dog for a little bit longer time.
We have talked a lot about food in your training, but our ultimate goal is to have a dog that listens even when you don't have food in your hand. That video right there is going to show you how to have the perfect timing to accomplish that. If this is your first time on the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We publish new videos every single week to help you to have a well-behaved, four-legged family member. On that note, I'm Ken.
I'm Kayl.
Happy training.